In the late 1960s, Betty Broderick and Dan Broderick seemed like the perfect American couple. Betty, born into a large Catholic family, had always been ambitious. She envisioned a life of prosperity and family, a life that she believed could be achieved alongside her husband Dan. Dan was equally driven, and after their wedding, Betty supported him financially and emotionally as he pursued not one, but two prestigious degrees, medicine and law. With her working multiple jobs, Betty was the backbone of their marriage, raising their children while Dan built his career. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the Brodericks appeared to have it all. Dan had become one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego, pulling in millions. They lived in a beautiful house in the affluent neighborhood of La Jolla, attended glamorous parties, and were well respected in their community. They had 4 beautiful children. Betty believed she had sacrificed and worked for everything they had built together, and now she was ready to enjoy the fruits of that hard work. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Dan began to grow distant from Betty. He became more withdrawn, critical, and less engaged with family life. In 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant, a bright and beautiful young woman named Linda Kolkina, who was more than 15 years younger than Betty. Despite Dan's constant denials, Betty soon suspected there was more going on between them. Her intuition, sharpened from years of managing the household and their complicated lives, told her that something wasn't right. Betty's suspicions weren't unfounded. In truth, Dan had been having an affair with Linda for months. He wasn't just enthralled by Linda's youth and beauty, but also by the fact that she admired and idolized him in a way that Betty, burdened by years of hard work, no longer did. When Betty confronted Dan, he gaslit her, insisting she was being paranoid and irrational. This rejection only fueled her rage and obsession. Betty's world was crumbling before her eyes, and she found herself spiraling into bitterness and fury. In 1985, Dan finally admitted to the affair and filed for divorce, leaving Betty shattered. The divorce process was agonizing and drawn out. Dan, a successful lawyer, wielded his legal power over her at every turn. Betty, who had sacrificed so much to build their life, felt she was losing everything: her home, her children, her financial security. She believed Dan was using his connections and legal expertise to manipulate the court system, leaving her with nothing. He even won full custody of their children, further driving the wedge of resentment into her heart. Betty's anger became uncontrollable. She left hundreds of unhinged, profanity-laden messages on Dan's answering machine, vandalized his home, and at one point even drove her car through his front door. She felt abandoned, betrayed, and desperate for justice. But no one seemed to be listening. As the divorce battle raged on, Dan was quickly moving on with Linda. They bought a new house, and in 1989, they got married, throwing a lavish wedding, the kind of life Betty believed she had earned. Dan even rewrote his will, cutting Betty out completely and leaving everything to Linda. Betty's bitterness consumed her. She could not bear the thought of Dan and Linda living the life she had sacrificed so much for. The anger, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over in a way no one could have predicted. On November 5th, 1989, in the early morning hours, Betty snuck into Dan and Linda's home. She had stolen a key from her daughter, giving her access to the house she used to call her own. Armed with a revolver, Betty made her way to their bedroom. Dan and Linda were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm about to hit. Without hesitation, Betty fired 5 shots, killing both Dan and Linda in their bed. Dan was hit in the chest and side, while Linda was shot in the head and chest. As they lay there lifeless, Betty turned herself into the police, admitting what she had done. Betty's trial was a media sensation. The story of a betrayed wife pushed to the brink struck a chord with the public. Many saw Betty as a woman who had been wronged, emotionally and financially, by a powerful man. Others viewed her as a vengeful, unstable woman who refused to move on. At trial, Betty defended her actions as the result of years of emotional abuse and manipulation. She claimed she didn't intend to kill them, only to confront them and scare them. But the prosecution argued that this was cold-blooded murder, fueled by jealousy and rage. In the end, the jury convicted Betty Broderick of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The Betty Broderick case remains one of the most notorious examples of how infidelity and divorce can turn toxic, leading to tragic consequences. It highlighted issues of power dynamics, gender roles, and the emotional toll of divorce in the 1980s. Betty became something of a folk anti-hero for many women who felt trapped in similar situations of being betrayed or undervalued in their marriages. However, the brutal murder of Dan and Linda stands as a stark reminder of how unchecked anger and obsession can destroy lives. The case has been adapted into books, films, and series, and Betty herself has expressed little remorse for her actions, claiming that Dan drove her to it.